When you first start programming in assembly language and you get this to happen, that's pretty exciting, right? You get this sprite to move and you made this code yourself. But that's not really what you want, is it? No, what you want is something like this. A real game where you have something to do. Where you have a goal, where there are dangers, and basically making a game yourself. That's what we really want, right? So let's do it. Let's make this game. Hey there, welcome back. So let's take a closer look at this game, because there's actually a lot going on, even though this game looks very basic. So of course I can move this sprite around using my joystick, but that's not enough. If the sprite goes here against the wall, he stops. And if it collides with a coin like this, I pick up the coin, and you can see here I have a coin counter. And then we have this enemy going back and forth, and if I collide with him, the game restarts. So there's a lot going on. We have character collision, we have sprite collision, and there's also something going on there when I'm collecting these coins. And also when I've collected all the coins, a door appears down here, and the player suddenly is really happy. So like I said, there's a lot going on here. So how many lines of code is this? It's around 780 lines of code, more or less. So here's the code for the entire game. Now at first something like this looks really intimidating, but if we use all the knowledge that we have about the Commodore 64, then it's not so bad. Because most of the lines is just LDA, SDA, stuff like that. Also, I have a lot of constants here. So those are also not really part of the code or the end product. But we need to understand a few things before we can start a project like this. Okay, so this is going to be a mini-series. I don't know how many episodes yet, but probably at least 2 or 3 episodes. So we need to break it down a little bit. But in order to make this game, there are a few things we need to know. So I'm going to assume that you know the basics. And you know, a lot of people have asked me, can you make some intermediate content? And that's what I'm going to do right now. So I'm going to assume that you know LDA, STA, you know about the stack, tables, stuff like that. So I will not be explaining the basics like that. Alright, so making a Commodore 64 game. Like I said, there are a lot of things we need to know. We need to know how to make sprite graphics and background graphics. Now we have charpad and spritepad for that. But we also need to know how to draw background graphics on the screen. Now I have a few videos about that, so we're not going to be talking about that. Also, you need to read the joystick input and display and move sprites around. We're not going to be talking about that either. But we're going to be talking about the last 4 things here. Checking the character collision. So what happens when a sprite collides with background characters? We're going to create character reactions. What happens when the sprite collides with a coin? And we also need to check collision between sprites. What happens if 2 sprites collide? And we need to handle that in a special way. So basically, we're talking about character collision and collision between sprites. That's what we're going to focus on in this mini-series. So let's also make sure that we know a few basic things here. Like I said, we have drawn the background graphics. We know how to do that. And we put a sprite on the screen. When this sprite is on the screen, when it's on the very top left corner here, his position isn't 0, 0. No, when he's at the very top here, his X position is 24 and his Y position is 50. That's the position when he's on the very top left. Now, of course, he can go off screen, so he can get X position 0 and Y position 0. But when he's visible at the top left corner, X is 24, Y is 50. That's very important. We need to remember that for later. Alright. But what about the sprite's position? Where do we check that? Is it in the middle, the right, or the bottom? No, it's in the top left corner of the sprite, where I have this red dot. That's where we're checking the X and Y position. So the position of the sprite is in the top left corner. So when we're saying that the sprite is at position 50, 24, that's this little dot here. That's the X and Y position of the sprite, of any sprite. Right, so how does this work? A sprite and the backgrounds. Are there any correlation between the two? Well, not really. I mean, there is a way, default in the Commodore 64, to check for a collision between sprite and the background. But to be honest, it's not really good, so I think we should make something better ourselves. But the problem is that a sprite, when it moves around on the screen, it moves pixel by pixel up, left, right, so it's pixel by pixel movement. The screen on the Commodore 64 is made up of these columns and rows. So we have a lot of these small cells. We have 1,000 cells on the screen. Each of these cells contains a character. So this background graphics here are characters placed in those cells. Now, how's this going to work? Sprite moves pixel by pixel, but these background characters are not placed on the screen pixel by pixel. They move in a grid. So we need to figure something out there. Remember, when I put the sprite on the screen here, his X position is 24, Y position is 50. So it seems a little complicated now here at the beginning. How can we check if this sprite collides with the background? If he's moving in pixel positions and the background characters are placed in this 8x8 grid, or in this grid anyway. Well, we need to find out how big a character is. A character is 8 pixels wide and 8 pixels tall. So, like I said, this is an 8x8 grid. If we remember that each character is 8 pixels wide and 8 pixels tall. So there is a correlation there, but it's not so easy to figure this out. A character is 8 pixels wide, 8 pixels tall. A sprite is 24 pixels wide and 21 pixels tall. Right? So what does a sprite look like surrounded with characters? It looks like this. And here I've marked the characters with red. So he's surrounded by 3 characters on the top, 3 characters here, 3 here, and 3 here. So as you can see, there is a correlation. Each of these characters are 8 pixels. And this sprite is 24 pixels. 8 pixels wide here. 8 plus 8, that's 16. Plus 8, that's 24. So this sprite is 4 characters wide. Now it's not quite, 3 characters wide. Now it's not quite 3 characters tall, because it's just 21 pixels tall. But these things are very important to remember. Why? Well, we need to check the collision between the sprite and the characters. So we need to be absolutely sure that we're comfortable with this kind of stuff. Because when the sprite is moving right, we need to check 3 positions. We need to check the center of the sprite. We need to check the lower part of the sprite. And we need to check the upper part of the sprite. So we need to check 3 characters when he's moving right. We don't just want to check like the bottom character or whatever. If he's moving towards this wall, we need to make sure that he checks all these 3 characters. If he's moving up, we need to check these 3 characters. So like we can see here, if he's moving up, we need to check the center, the left and the right. So we need to check 3 characters for every direction he's moving. Right. So we need to find a system for this. We need to find a system where we know where the sprite is in relation to these characters. Because like I said, the sprite is just moving in pixel positions. Characters are placed in this grid. But now we know that a character is 8 pixels wide, 8 pixels tall. That means that when the sprite moves down 8 pixels, he's on the second row here. Let me show you an example. Here I have the sprite on the top left of the screen. Now, as you remember, his X position is 24, his Y position is 50. But let's forget about that right now. He's on the top of the screen here. The row is 0. So he's on the top of the top row. He's on the very top here. I'm going to move this sprite 8 pixels down now. And let's notice this row counter. I moved this sprite 8 pixels down, and now he's on row number 1. If I move him 8 pixels more down, now he's on row number 2. So I'm counting the rows on the very top here. Row 0, row 1, and now he's on row number 2. If I move him 8 pixels further down, then he's at row 3, 8 pixels down, then he's at 4, and so on. So every time he moves 8 pixels down, he's on a new row. Now, knowing this can help us make a system. So there is a correlation between the characters and the sprite. We just need to program a system for this. We need to find out how we can check each of these rows and find out what characters are there. Now, obviously we need to do the same with columns as well, but it's the same principle. A character is both 8 pixels tall and 8 pixels wide. So it's the same thing. So how can we do that? Well, I usually have these screen tables that I call them. Now these screen tables are 2 tables, row low and row high. Of course, now you need to know about the low byte and high byte. So what is this? Well, in this case, I've used the default memory address for screen memory, 0400. And in this row low table, I get the low byte of every row here. On the row high, I get the high byte for every row. So we use these symbols to get the low byte and get the high byte. Which means actually this table here is just going to be these last 2 numbers, because that's the low byte, 00, 28, 50 and so on. Here on the high byte table, I'm just going to get 04, 04, 04 until I get further down where it's 05 and 06 and so on. So by loading the same position from this and from this table, we combine them, and then we get the screen RAM address for a specific row. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 all the way down to 24. So we have 24 rows on the screen. Then of course we need to find a column but when we're using zero page indexing, we can use the Y register to find the column. So this is the same principle that we use when we're drawing graphics on the screen. That's how we can find what row, or we can find what character is on a specific position on the screen. But there's a few challenges here. First of all, we need to handle this. The start position where the Y where the Y is 50 and the X is 24. We need to handle that in some way. The way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to subtract 50 from the Y position and subtract 24 from the X position, which will make this the Y position 0, X position 0 when he's on the top left of the screen. I'm going to show you how I do that in just a moment. To make the top left corner of the screen X0, Y0, we must subtract the default offsets. So when this sprite starts at the top left of the screen, his X is 0, his Y is 0. That's going to make this so much easier for us when we're going to find out where he is in relation to the characters on the screen. Now we just need to figure something out. When he moves down a row, let's do that. Let's move him down a row now, this sprite. Now he's at row number 1. But that's not pixel position 1. If I move him further down now, this is not pixel position 2, even though he's at row number 2. So what's the Y position of this guy now? He's at row 6, yeah, great, but what's the actual Y position here for this sprite? So this is the last piece of the puzzle. We need to make a system where we can get the X and Y position of the sprite, and we need to turn that into, in this case, the number of the row. So he's down here and it's row number 7, but before we get this number, we need to do something. We need to take the Y position here, in this case, and divide it by 8, because each of these characters are 8 pixels tall. So he didn't move 8 pixels down now, he moved 7. So he moved 7 times 8. So the Y position of the sprite now is 7 times 8. That's the actual Y position of the sprite. So we need to do the opposite. We need to divide whatever position of the sprite has now with 8, because each of these characters is 8 pixels tall. So just need to go here, open a calculator, and let's say the sprites, let's say we already subtracted the default 50 and 24 that we talked about before. So now when he's on the top left corner, his X is 0, his Y is 0. Okay. So now he moved down quite a bit. Now he's here. So his X position is, let's say, 56. Now I need to divide the Y position, the actual Y position of the sprite, with 8, like I said. And now I get the row number. So by dividing the X and Y position by 8, we get the row number and the column number. So that's why he's at row number 7 now, but his actual Y position is 56 after subtracting the default 50. So I hope that makes sense. So that's how we can find out exactly where the sprite is on the screen in relation to the characters. Okay, it's time to look at some code now. If you remember from back in the Commodore 64 programming course, those videos, I talked about we don't have multiplication and division in assembly language. We can't in an easy way do multiplication and division. We can only add and subtract. Well, we can do multiplication and division, but it requires some additional programming. But since we're dividing by 8 now, there's a very simple way to do that in assembly language. It's actually this. LSR. Do that 3 times. Now what's LSR? That's logical shift right. So we're bit shifting to the right, and we're doing that 3 times. Now if I show this on a calculator, it will be a little clearer. So let's take an example like we saw earlier. Let's say the sprite's Y position is 56 now. 56, and that's after subtracting the 50 default offset there. So now the sprite's Y position is 56. Alright, so now I'm gonna bit shift 3 times to the right, which is what I'm doing here, LSR 3 times. 1, 2, 3. So by bit shifting 3 times to the right, I have divided this number by 8. So that's how we do it here in assembly language. Bit shift, if we bit shift just once to the right, then we divide by 2, so we get a half. But this time we need to divide by 8, so we're bit shifting 3 times to the right. LSR times 3, that's divide by 8. So basically what we're doing here, we're getting the Y position of the sprite 0. We're subtracting 50 to make the Y position be 0 at the top of the screen. And then bit shifting 3 times to the right to divide by 8. That's how we solve this in code. Now before we look more at the code, let's just make absolutely sure that we know what's happening here. So what I actually need to do now is I need to figure out what characters. Let's say I want to move to the left now. This guy, I'm going to move him to the left. I need to find out what characters are to the left of the sprite. So when I get over here, he stops because this is a wall, and I want him to stop when he reaches a wall like this. If I move over to the right now, there's a coin, and I want him to collect the coin. So the point here is that we need to know what characters are in front of the sprite when he's moving. So when I'm moving left, I need to check those 3 characters over there. When I'm moving right, I need to check those characters. When I'm moving up, I need to check those 3 characters, and so on. So that's the goal here. We need to find out what these characters are, and then we need to read them in the code. So let's do that now. Let's just very quickly look at the main code here. So I start the main part of the code here, and I'm just initializing the system stack. Now that's something you don't absolutely have to do, but in this case I'm restarting the game when I get hurt or whatever, and then I jump to the main method here, or the main label, sorry. So then I need to initialize the stack again, because yeah, let's not go into the stack right now. It's just a good practice to do that. Then I get to game setup here, and I use this subroutine. This is the kernel routine to clear the screen, which is at address E1544. That's the kernel routine, so when I say jump to that subroutine, the screen gets cleared. And then I just set the border color the background color, and since I'm using multicolor, I'm also setting the extra color 1, extra color 2, and since my sprites are also multicolor, I set extra color 1 and extra color 2 for those as well. And then I set screen memory setup, screen RAM at 0400, character set at 3800. I set the screen to use multicolor, and then I just reset some variables by loading a 0 and storing that into all my variables. Then I have a subroutine to load the map, so I just load the background on the screen. Then I have another subroutine called update coin counter, and then here I have sprite setup, which is basically placing the sprites on the screen. So sprite 0 is going to start at 144 X position, 162 Y position, and I set him to green. And I do the similar thing for sprite 1 here. Also has something called enemy direction. Let's not look at that right now. Then I set the graphics, set the sprite pointers, and finally I just set both of those to multicolor and enable those sprites. So basic setup here, nothing special so far. But what I wanted to show you down here is my game loop. This is the loop that's running all the time. Now this example is a lazy example. I've not spent any time setting up raster interrupts or anything like that. I just did things in a very simple way. So since I'm not using raster interrupts, I need to have a little delay loop here to slow down the sprites when they're moving. So it's not ideal, but it's just a simple way to make this work. So I start my little game loop here with a small delay. Then I read joystick in port 2. Then I have subroutine to move the enemy. We're not going to be looking at that right now, and checking the enemy collision. So I just want you to be aware of that. This is not the optimal code. This is not ideal. This is just a very simple example to make it easy to show you how some of these things work. Let's look at the read joystick 2 subroutine. Now, like I said, we're not going to be spending too much time on this because this is something we have talked about before. But let's just look at a simple example here. When I push the joystick up, I check, do I push the joystick up or not? Well, if I don't, then I'll just move down here. But if I do move the joystick up, then here we get to the character collision checks. Like I said, we need to check 3 collision checks for each direction. Here I'm checking up left, then I'm checking up center and up right. And if any of these checks result in a collision with a solid tile, a tile that I've defined as a wall or whatever, if any of these 3 results in that, then we have a solid collision, so I won't be moving up. Okay, so how does this work? CheckCharCollision. That's not assembly language. So what is this? Of course, this is a macro. So I have my macros here at the top of the file. I made a macro called CheckCharCollision. By making it a macro, I can put some arguments in here. So, like always, we need to give things meaning. We give, like when I'm making this macro here, I have a system where I have sprite types, which means is this an enemy or is the player, something like that. And that's just a system I made where I say down here on my constants that if it's a player, then that's just the number 1. The enemy, that's the number 2. So just to give the things some sort of meaning. So I have a sprite type, but then I put in here the X position, Y position, and then I also put in some offsets. So if I need to put some offsets in here, then I can do that. So basically I just put those things into variables. What I get from these, I've just put them into variables here. Then I run the subroutine CheckCharCollision. So let's go down to CheckCharCollision, which is here. So I'm backing the X and Y register to the stack because I'm going to use those registers later. Again, it's just good practice to be careful with the X and Y registers. But here in my CheckCharCollision subroutine, I load the sprite Y position, that variable, which, as you remember, was something I got from the macro. And like we talked about before, I'm subtracting the default Y position of a sprite, which is 50. So I'm subtracting that from the sprite's Y position to make sure that it has Y position 0 at the top of the screen. Then I add sprite offset Y. So this offset will allow me to check the top, the center, or the bottom. If I don't put anything in there, I check the absolute top of the sprite. But let's say I want to check the center of the sprite from on the offset, on the Y axis. Then I just add 10 because a sprite size is 21 pixels tall, so half of that is around 10. So if I add 10 as a sprite Y offset, then I'm checking the center of the sprite to find out what row on the screen I'm at. So I get that, subtract 50, add that offset, and then, like we talked about, I bit shift 3 times to the right to divide by 8. So now I know what row I'm at. Then I transfer that to the X register, because now I'm going to read from the screen tables, row low and row high. So I do that here, comma X. So whatever number here I got here is the row number. I use that as an offset for my tables, so that now I can store those into 0 page addresses. And now, of course, I can use 0 page indexing later. But first I need to do the same thing for the X position. So I just get the X position, subtract 24. If I need to add an offset, then I'll do that here. And then bit shift 3 times to the right to divide by 8. This time I'm transferring to the Y register, transfer A to Y. Because down here, finally, I can say load A with the 0 page indexing, comma Y. Now Y, in this case now, has become the column. So I use the tables to find out what row, but now I'm using Y here, based on the sprite's X position, to find what column he's at, or what column we're checking. So now we should be able to find exactly where on the screen we're checking. So when I say load A with this now, I'm actually reading a cell from the screen. And that's going to give me a screen code. What character is placed exactly at this position that I'm checking? What screen code is at that position right now? Store that in a variable called CharCollision. And then we have some character reaction. We're not going to be looking at that right now. But basically, this is the important part. I've gotten the screen code. So then I just, then this subroutine is over. So if we go back now to the subroutine where we have the joystick moving the sprite, I have this macro, put the values I needed to put in there, and then I got, when I ran the CheckCharCollision subroutine, I got a screen code. So now I can check. The last thing that happens in that subroutine is LDA char collision, that variable. So when I get to here, I have something in A. I have something in the accumulator, and that is a screen code. So I'm checking char solid, which is screen code 65. Now screen code 65, that's this character right here. This tile, this brick tile. So that's the character I'm checking. Is it this one? Is it character 65? Well, if it is, branch if equal solid collision up. Then I just branch down here and I can't move up. This is where I'm checking the up left collision. So if it's 65, then branch down here, don't move up. Alright, but what if it's not 65? Well, then we do the next check, which is up center. Again, we're checking for 65. If there's no 65 there, then we move on. We do it again for up right. And if that's 65, then we stop. But if none of these result in a screen code of 65, so we're not colliding with this character. Maybe we're just colliding with these black characters there. Then we can move up. So then I say decrement the sprite's Y position, but only if none of these result in screen code 65, which means we're not colliding with anything when we're going up. So that's what I have here for all of the 4 directions: up, down, left, right. I do the same thing for all of them, but of course I need to adjust the X and Y position and the different offsets. I'll be checking up, center, or down, and so on. So that's the character collision. That's how I'm checking character collision in my game here. So I think that's enough for this time. Next time we're going to be looking at character collision. What happens when I collide with this coin? But for now, that's it. Have a great day. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.